Alright guys, today I'm going to do chapter 65 and 66 on the same video. And we are reading in Anson's room today, yes. Mr. Smith and Major Andre were up at dawn. They thanked the man who had put them up there for the night. Andre offered to pay something, but was refused with the words, "You can pass the welcome on to others in good time." When the two men mounted their horses, the light of dawn was made dimmer with the morning fog and slight drizzle. "Don't worry," said Mr. Smith. "I know the road perfectly. We're heading for the town of Crompond." They moved slowly through the fog. It was Mr. Abbott who, with a gentle shake of my shoulder, woke me from deep sleep. "Your friend Mr. Paulding is here," she said. "Oh, Mrs. Abbott, sorry." "Your friend Mrs. Paulding is here. Mr. Paulding is here," she said. "He's waiting in the kitchen." Though my body sorely ached, I bestirred myself. The morning light was dullish, the air felt damp. I went into the kitchen where Mr. Paulding was waiting. He seemed to fill the small room space. "Good morning, Miss Calderwood," he said. "I have managed to find some friends to help us." Mrs. Abbott handed me a bowl of warm milk and some bread. I devoured it in haste and handed her back the bowl. "Thank you for your kindness, madam," I said. "My pleasure. I hope all goes well." So did I. John Paulding and I stepped out of the house. A thin ground fog and slight drizzle softened the world, much like the fuzz upon a peach. Two young men were waiting. Each had muskets in the crooks of their arms. "My friends," said Mr. Paulding, introducing them. "Isaac von Wart, David Williams. Gentlemen, my family friend, Miss Calderwood." They nodded a friendly greeting, but said no words. "We need to wait along the Albany Road," Mr. Paulding explained. "Do you mind the wet?" he asked me. "Not at all. We best go on." We left the town and turned north along the same road I had come by the day before. Mr. Paulding's friends went before us. "Mr. Paulding," I said, "if we do stop Major Andre, what will happen next?" "I'll be honest and say I hadn't thought that far ahead, but I suppose we turn him over to the regular army." "What will they do to him?" "If what you say is correct, I suppose they'll hang him." I felt as if someone had struck me across the face. Let it be admitted, throughout my pursuit of John Andre, I had never contemplated what might be the consequence if he were captured. All my efforts had been on preventing his meeting with General Arnold and then averting the loss of West Point. Yet despite those efforts, evidence suggested, but did not yet prove, that a meeting had taken place. In short, as far as I knew, I had failed. The one chance of stopping the treasonous play was to keep Andre from reaching New York City. Now, perhaps, with Mr. Paulding's help, we could stop him. But if we did, and Mr. Paulding did turn him over to our regular soldiers, what did I wish to happen next? I will say it plain. The mere consideration that John Andre might be hung appalled me. I beg you to recall that I had never forgotten Nathan Hale and his fate. The notion of Andre being hung filled me with profound horror and guilt. Did I feel guilty that I might be the means by which he might die, or was I guilty of wishing to spare him? But was not John Andre the enemy? Did he not refuse to help William and therefore bring on my brother's ghastly death? Had I so forgotten the nightmare of the sugar house and the good intent? Had John Andre not taken up arms and used them to kill my countrymen on the field of battle, in prisons? Was not his government, his king, bent on suppressing our freedom, our natural rights? Was he not at this same moment working to bring defeat to my country? He was guilty of these things. Were there not reasons enough to stop him? Was I to be that gross and false image, the weak woman who pushes aside all reason to embrace the folly of blind emotion? The mere possibility was a scandal to me. Sophia Calderwood, who wished to think of myself as strong of will and mind. John Andre no longer knew me. Why should I know him as other than the enemy? And yet I was anguished, an anguish from which I could not free myself. I have said before how the war made us live lives of deception. There was the question, had I deceived myself? Was all I done for noble cause to have my nation's fair revenge? Excuse me. Or were my actions motivated by my wish for him to recognize me, to treat me as he had done when I was a girl, when I fancied he cared for me? How How contemptible. How low. How degrading. Contemptible. Sorry. How contemptible. How low. How degrading. Never mind what I been. The question was, what would I do now? The fog had mostly lifted when John Andre and Joshua Smith, moving south, reached the small cluster of houses known as the town of Crompond. Blocking the road was an armed young man in American uniform. "Captain Foote," he announced himself. "Where are you men going?" "General Arnold has asked me to escort Mr. Anderson south," replied Mr. Smith. Andre handed down Arnold's pass. Captain Foote glanced at it briefly, handed it back, and waved them on. "Colonel Jameson's dragoons are at Wright's Mill," he said to Andre. "They might give you an escort." Mr. Smith thanked the young officer. He and Andre headed south. "Sounds like you might want to avoid Wright's Mill," said Mr. Smith. Andre heard the warning, but said nothing. They stopped at a farmhouse and asked an old woman if they could buy some food. The woman offered some corn mush, which was gratefully received. She would not take and offered payment. Do you think the old woman is the one that Sophia stayed with? I don't know. A mile farther down the road, Mr. Smith halted. "Well, sir," he said, "Pines Bridge is just a short way along. From here on, you'll more likely find less Continental troops and more cowboys. You know, those are the lower party. To be honest, I've worked to keep myself in the shade, neither light or dark. You do best to go yourself." "I'm sure I'll be fine," said Andre, and the two shook hands. "Thank you for your efforts, sir." With a farewell wave, Smith turned his horse and headed back north. Andre, now alone, pressed toward the south. When he reached the Croton River, he passed over the Pines Bridge. Half a mile farther on, he came upon a boy walking by the road. "Hello, lad. Am I heading right for Wright's Mill?" "Wiley, shh, I'm reading aloud." My cat wants all this attention. Come here. Oh, okay, bye. Crazy cat. About a mile, there's a ford to the left of Wright's Mill, to the right for Tarrytown. "Thank you," said Andre, and threw the boy a sixpence for his information. Andre pressed on. As the boy had told him, he reached a fork in the road. He paused. Wright's Mill was where the American dragoons were stationed. He turned to the right, towards Tarrytown, which, as we know, is where Mr. Paulding lives, right? Okay, chapter 66. With Mr. Paulding in the lead, the three men moved along the road. I came behind, trying desperately to deal with my swirling thoughts and emotions. What have I done? I kept asking myself. What should I do? Shortly after we left town, Mr. Paulding brought us to a thickly wooded area that crowded in upon both sides of the road. "Miss Calderwood," said Mr. Paulding, "my friends and I shall keep ourselves on this side. I suggest you remain on the other side out of sight, but not so far that I can't signal you. If someone appears, I'll look to you. You'll need to watch. If it's your man, just raise your hand and we'll stop him. If you don't signal, we'll let him pass. Does that make sense?" "Yes, sir," I replied, finding it hard to speak. "It does." "Do you wish to confront him?" "No," I said instantly. We deployed ourselves. The three of them went to one side of the road, and I, quite alone, was fairly hidden on the other. As we waited, all those questions I just laid before you kept churning within my head, each with a multitude of possibilities, choices, wishes, and regrets. I did not know what to do or think. It all came down to two things. What were my feelings about John Andre? And if he did come, how should I act? What feelings did I have for him? I believe we waited for a few hours. It was yet morning, and I was still lost in all my mental commotion when I saw that Mr. Paulding was waving his hand at me. With a pounding heart, I turned my eyes along the road. A man appeared, pushing a barrow. When I saw that it was not Andre, I made no sign to Mr. Paulding. The man passed by. We continued to wait. It was not long before a brown horse and a rider appeared. Though his clothing was utterly different than I had ever seen upon him, I immediately knew it was John Andre. What's more, I could tell from the way he sat upon the horse that he was exhausted, and I, my heart anything but calm, felt a pang of pity for the man. I darted a glance across the road. Mr. Paulding was looking right at me, waiting again for me to sign, or not. "Oh, weak heart," I cried to myself. "Tell me what to do. Shall I preserve his life or mine?" I lifted my hand. The moment I did, Mr. Paulding and his two friends fairly leaped out upon the road so that Major Andre could not go forward. Taken by surprise, he clutched nervously at the horse's reins and stared down upon the men, but mostly at Mr. Paulding, who had grabbed the horse's bridle. In fact, I believe the green German military coat my friend was wearing confused him, for Andre, settling himself upon the saddle with all dignity on display, said, "Gentlemen, I trust you belong to our party?" "What party is that?" said Mr. Paulding. "The lower," said Andre. Then he added, "I am an officer in the British service, and I've been on a particular business in the country. I hope you will not detain me." The men exchanged glances, after which Mr. Paulding said, "Climb down, sir." Andre, not budging, said, "But I must get along." No one moved. "Down, sir," insisted Paulding. Apparently grasping that he must deal with these men, Andre pulled out Arnold's pass and handed it down. Isaac Van Wert took it and unfolded it. I'd rather suspect he could not read, for he passed it to Mr. Paulding, whom I knew could. "My lads," said an impatient Andre, "you're going to get yourselves into a lot of trouble." Mr. Van Wert grinned and said, "But you just said you were a British officer." "I'm engaged upon the general's business," said Andre. "Do you intend to rob me?" "You need not worry," said Mr. Paulding. "We don't intend to take your money." "Good," said Andre. "I don't have any." "British officers always have money," said Mr. Van Wert. He turned to Mr. Paulding. "Let's search him," said Mr. Paulding. "Get down," commanded Mr. Williams. After a moment of hesitation, Andre dismounted. The men removed his coat and jacket and went through his pockets. They found 2 watches and a few dollar bills, nothing more. They threw the clothing onto the ground. "Take off your boots," said Mr. Van Wert. Andre looked hard upon him as if insulted by the demand, but sat down upon the ground. Mr. Van Wert bent over and yanked off both boots. The men searched inside them. Once more they found nothing. It was Mr. Paulding who said, "Take off your socks." Andre did not move, but just sat there. Mr. Williams reached down and yanked off the right sock. They found nothing. It was an impatient Mr. Paulding who pulled off the left sock. When he did, the papers Arnold had given Andre tumbled out. Williams snatched them up and handed all to Mr. Paulding, who examined the papers closely. It was then he said, "This man is a spy." The end of chapter 66.